Hello, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our very first Cider webinar. Tonight, we'll be transporting you to beautiful orchards across 4 very different parts of the world. We're talking New Zealand, the United States, England, and Sweden. Hi, everyone. So our panel of artisan cider makers are here to demonstrate that their craft ciders, made from 100% fruit and not concentrate, have the complexity, quality, and elegance to qualify as wine. First off, I'd like to introduce you to our host this evening, the notorious Oz Clarke, OBE, a man who's considered to be one of the leading authorities on all things wine. And as cider is wine, I'm sure he knows his fermented apples too. So we'll be guiding you through tonight's session with our 5 guests, who I'm going to introduce in tasting order. First off, actually, doesn't have a cider, but we've got Alistair Morell, who is the man behind what is Cider is Wine, and he'll be explaining that a little bit more. But he's really the person the glue really that brings these incredible producers together here this evening. We've got Mark McGill. Hi, Mark.
Hello from New Zealand.
Well, you took my words out of my mouth. Mark's from New Zealand, from Able Cider, and his cider is the Able Method 2017. We have Eleanor. Thanks, Mark. We've got Eleanor Legger here from Eden Cider. Hi, Eleanor. And she's based in Vermont in the US, and her cider is the Siren Song 2019, which is she going to be dancing over the screen as well as Mark, or is there she does as well. We've got Simon Day. Simon's from Once Upon a Tree in Hereford, pretty close to most of us here in the UK. And his is the Bacchus Co-Fermented 2018. Thanks for the demonstration, Simon. And finally, we have Andreas Sundgren from Brandland, Sweden. His wine is the Claim Ice Cider 2017. So a little bit of housekeeping before we begin. This is a live seminar, so if you have any questions for Oz or our guests, please, or even if you have any sort of tasting notes that you want to share or food pairing suggestions for any of the ciders we're tasting today, please let us know from the chat box. It's down there if you haven't chatted there already. Be careful to make sure that you're responding to panelists and attendees. You can do a little drop down. You've got to click to do a little drop down part, because that way you're talking to everybody, not just panelists, because no one else will see it. And we'll be doing a little Q&A session at the end with Oz and all of the guests. So make sure you do ask your questions in there. And we're going to be running a poll towards the end. So please get involved and let us know which is your favorite cider. So that's enough from me. I'm going to hand you over to Oz and our wonderful guests, and enjoy. Ciao.
Thanks, Richard. Well, I think the first thing I should do is say hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night, basically, to everybody. And also introduce Alistair, because Alistair's the guy who has put this whole concept together. And Alistair, do you want to just take us through how Cider is Wine came to be and what you think it means?
Thanks, Oz. Good evening, everyone.
Wait, Alistair, one thing. Everyone should pour themselves a glass of wine, of cider now. I'm going to pour myself from Able.
Get stuck in now. Abel's going to be our first cider, so if you want to start there, that's fantastic. Cider is wine. Question or statement? Or both? Before I answer that, I need to delve into a bit of history. It's an honour to have Oz Clarke here talking about these ciders tonight, but it's been a bit of a journey. I first became aware of Oz Clarke when my father bought me a book, a signed one, The Wine Fact Finder. Yeah, it's true. The late 1980s, he gave me that book. That was just when I was starting out in the wine industry. A time when an Australian bottle of wine meant you put 3 holes in the top and you shake it on your chips, as the old Monty Python saying said. So I've been in the wine industry for a long time, most of my working life. And it was only when I started working with a Swedish cidery and I tasted their ciders that I had to take a step back. That cidery was Brandland, and I had to question everything that I once knew or thought I knew. When I did my wine exams 35 years ago, wine was held up as the only alcoholic drink that you could actually make from exclusively from its own fruit. Tasting this cider from Brandland made me say, wow, how can this be so delicious and so, well, wine-like? I had to go deeper. The Cambridge English Dictionary, or a definition of wine, is any alcoholic drink that's made from fruit or flowers. But cider is wine means much more than that. It's about an appreciation of cider, as much as wine. It's not about making cider into wine or wine into cider. The EU definition of wine is an alcoholic drink that partially or wholly fermented from freshly gathered grapes, and that is what we expect to buy from the supermarket or wine shop or online. Not so with cider. Cider is the Wild West when it comes to what makes it. Every country has its own version of what cider is, how it's made, and what goes into it. In this country, you need just 35% juice, all of which can be imported and from concentrate. So yes, you can import concentrate from China or United States or wherever in the world, reconstitute it in the UK. Hey ho, you've got a British cider. That's how it's 3 for £5 on supermarket shelves. In Sweden, it's 15%. In Spain, it's 100%. In Portugal, it's 0%. In Australia, it's 0%. And New Zealand. In the US, I think it's 50%. Eleanor will correct me, I've no doubt. But nonetheless, this is a time when we're talking about food and drink, we want to know where our foods come from, what's made it, who's made it, how does it go to be such a fantastic product? In the UK, we have a fantastic, unrivaled cider making history. And yet, it seems crazy that we don't celebrate or define what the real deal is. Ciders made from 100% juice, not from concentrate. Made just like wine. The great unknown about these 100% juice, not from concentrate, ciders, perries, and fruit wines, because we work with all of them, is that they're representative of what the French call terroir. That is where they come from, who made them, the varieties themselves, how they're made and aged. The diversity of styles and flavors is every bit as wide as wine, if not wider. So tonight we're going to take you through 4 of those ciders. Oz is going to take you through 4 of those ciders with 4, in our opinion, of the best 100% juice cider makers on the planet, representative of their terroir. Each is unique in its own way. And all cider is wine ciders start in the orchard. Like a grape wine, they ask a maker, what makes a great cider or wine? It's the fruit that they start with. So I say again, cider is wine. Question or statement? One that I'll leave you to consider and ponder for yourselves during the course of this evening. And we can discuss it in the Q&A at the end. Oz, what's your experience of cider?
Well, you don't want all my experiences of cider, Alistair.
No.
You certainly don't want to hear too much about Bill Notley's Scrumpy, which he sold by the pail. You had to bring your own pail to the farmyard door when we were kids, and it was about 1 and 6pence or 2 bob a pail. You don't want to hear about that.
No.
But can I just, I wrote a couple of things down here about cider is wine. Let me just, they absolutely back up what you say. Shall I just read them out? I said, so let's get this straight. 1, I pick the fruit. Grapes for wine, apples for cider. 2, I crush the fruit. And 3, I ferment the juice. Grape juice for wine, apple juice for cider. So it's there's nothing different yet. I ferment it either with wild local yeasts or with cultured yeasts, exactly the same. Then I sell it with bubbles or without. What have I done? What's the difference between wine and cider so far? Nothing. Flavor, yes, thank goodness, because there's quite enough wine in the world. Philosophy, no. Pure, properly grown fruit transformed into a delicious alcoholic drink by the simplest methods available. Real wine, real cider. Cider is wine. Well, put like that, it sounds like that. And I was thinking, how long have humans been making cider? Apples, they probably come from Kazakhstan thousands and thousands of years ago. Anyway, they've been around for an awful long time. And frankly, people have been making cider, I would have thought, as long as they've been growing apple trees. Now, apple trees, the apples drop off the tree when they're ripe. They get bruised, they start fermenting. And that's why windfalls in an orchard to this day smell so pungent. They're fermenting. And the pigs in an orchard, ask anybody who leaves their pigs in the orchard, the pigs in an orchard know that. They snaffle and munch them down and they get drunk. Animals have been getting drunk on fermenting fruit since before the humans were around. So what marks humans out as a superior species is their ability to put two and two together. And when it comes to drink, to say, those pigs look happy. How could we cash in on that? Well, the Greeks and the Romans and the Celts, they all made alcoholic drinks from apples. They made beer too, but it's much more complicated to make beer than cider. With cider, if you can squeeze the juice out of the apples and let it be, it'll ferment into some kind of cider. Simple. That's what they did with grapes in the warm south, and in the cold north, they used apples. So from our point of view in England, and in Britain rather, William the Conqueror's arrival from Normandy in 1066 greatly increased the interests in apples and in orchards and in cider. And by 1204, 800 years ago, we're finding the first named variety of apple, the pearmain. In 2021, pearmains are still going. No one can give me the name of a grape variety still going from 1204. Now, apple varieties mutate even faster than grape varieties do. So by now, experts reckon there may be 60,000 different varieties of apple all over the place. Now, there may be more, but there won't be less. And potentially that means 60,000 different flavors, although, as we all know, a lot of those apples won't have any particular flavors, just like most grape varieties don't have any particular flavor. But that's a lot of apples. And this evolution, for those of you who haven't really picked up on the different varieties of apples and the species, this evolution has created a big divide between so-called dessert or culinary apples and cider varieties. And it's a really important difference because you can make very good cider out of eating apples. Coxes, russets, sturmers, bramleys, they all make attractive, gentle, fruity ciders with lots of flavor. But you can't eat a cider apple and expect to keep your teeth. And the reason is it's in the skins and it's in the flesh. Firstly, there are two main classes of cider apples, bitter sweet and bitter sharp. Now that bitter is fundamental. It's the amount of bitter tannin in the skins. All good cider apples have got enough tannin in the skin to make it really harsh if you get it into your mouth. And frankly, the best cider apple's skin, you can hardly chew it. But just as in red wine, that tannin is massively important in the structure of the cider, of the wine, so it is in cider. And that's to do with it being an antioxidant, to do with being a clarifying agent, and to do with it being antibacterial, and to do with it allowing the cider to age beautifully and change with age. And that flesh, well, bitter sweets will have more sugar, bitter sharps will have more acid. Both of them have got lots of tannin, but all the cider varieties will have flesh packed with cellulose. Now, when you chew the flesh, it becomes like a sodden ball of cotton wool in your mouth. It's no good for eating. It is perfect for cider because you crush and press an eating apple and you create a possibly delicious but gooey, mushy mess that you then try to turn into a fermentable liquid. You crush and press a cider apple and all the juice is squeezed out of that chewy flesh, leaving just the cellulose, the pips, and the skin behind. All the juice is out there making cider. Now, I think this idea of Alistair's of cider is wine is brilliant because, of course, in Britain, 400 years ago, cider was wine in Britain. Sparkling cider was called the English champagne and served at court. And the champagne makers, now this makes me feel good. The champagne makers got the idea of how to make wine sparkle, by creating a second fermentation in the bottle. They got the idea from the cider makers of Hereford, Gloucester, and Somerset. They'd been doing it for generations before Dom Pérignon supposedly started doing it at the beginning of the 18th century. And it looks as though Alistair's 5-year-old has drawn a complex series of pictures there showing how you do it. Well, I tell you what it means. To make a wine sparkle by the so-called traditional method. And by the way, our first wine that we've got tonight, the Abel from New Zealand, is made by this traditional method. And Mark will tell you more about it in a moment. But it basically means that you make the wine ferment, or the cider ferment for a second time in a bottle by adding a bit of yeast and a bit of sugar. Now, you then bang a cork into the bottle, and the fermentation happens underneath enormous pressure, creating alcohol and creating carbon dioxide. The carbon dioxide normally would all go off into the air. It can't, because you've got a cork stuck in the top of the bottle. And luckily, carbon dioxide is a very soluble gas. It's about 20 times more soluble than nitrogen, for instance. So all of that carbon dioxide dissolves in the wine. And that's what is called the traditional method, a second fermentation inside the bottle. But that was impossible to do before the 17th century, because basically it's King James I of England, God bless him. We were running out of trees in England because we were using all our trees for smelting furnaces and things. And King James said, you've got to stop using trees for fuel for your furnaces, not allowed to, from 1615 onwards. The point was that he was making more money from selling trees to the Navy so they could make ships and presumably go and fight wars with France. So he said, no one is allowed to use trees chopped down for furnaces. Well, luckily, Britain has got this other dirty, mucky, black stuff called coal. Now, in the northeast of England, they've got coal. They've also got coal in the Forest of Dean, right on the River Severn, and the Forest of Dean is right over the River Severn from the fruit apple orchards of Gloucestershire. And so what happens with coal is it burns far hotter than wood, and so consequently you can make glass far stronger than a wood fire. By chance, it's also very impure, so that the glass is much blacker, which is great because it protects whatever's inside it from sunlight. if you've got a strong bottle, it means that this second fermentation inside the bottle won't blow the bottle up. In France, you try to do that with their lovely, delicate wood-fired glass, and the bottles all blow up all the time. Another crucial thing, Portugal and England had always been good friends since the Treaty of Windsor in 1272 or something. So Portugal was the place where they made cork. Now, we had always kept the knowledge of cork as a stopper. France didn't have that knowledge. They weren't friendly with Portugal. They used all kinds of things like lumps of wood, rags wrapped in olive oil, God knows what, to shove in the top of their bottles, and couldn't keep a seal. So we had a strong bottle, we had a cork which kept a seal like that. And it meant that if you put something to re-ferment in that bottle, you could then tie it down with a bit of twine, leave it for 2 or 3 years, and all of this second fermentation would create wonderful bubbles, but also wonderful extra flavors. And so that's a bit of a digression, but it's a terribly important point, because it shows that 400 years ago, cider from the west of England was absolutely regarded as the best kind of drink that the court of St. James in London could possibly want. So I think we should bring in Mark here, because Mark is now making a modern version of that in I would say the sylvan paradise of Nelson in the South Island of New Zealand. Now, Nelson is a genuinely gorgeous, bucolic place. It produces nearly 60% of all New Zealand cider. It's the area, it's the most famous apple area. If you, and I'm sure many of you have eaten New Zealand Brabants, the Brabant was raised in the Upper Moutere area, which is bang in the middle of Nelson. And of course, the Upper Moutere area is also exactly where Able Cider is based. The New Zealand Cider Festival happens in Nelson. By the way, Captain Cook carried cider on his ships to combat scurvy amongst the sailors. Now, I wonder, did he carry seedlings with him as well? Did he carry the odd cider tree somewhere down in the hold? Did New Zealand get a very early look in at some beautiful apple trees from Gloucester and Worcestershire and Herefordshire? I wonder. But Mark, welcome from the breakfast time glories of Nelson.
Thank you, Oz.
Tell us a little bit about Nelson, and tell us about how on earth you got involved in making what is in effect a champagne method, a traditional method cider.
Well, yeah, I guess first of all, thanks for everyone coming, and it's great to talk about such a novel subject, cider as wine. So, I mean, for us, we started making cider mainly because my wife, who's from a well-known wine family, she didn't really like drinking beer, and so she started drinking cider. And
say the name.
Sophie Healy. So James Healy is her father, ex-Cloudy Bay winemaker and winemaker for Dog Point. If you want to try it, there's plenty of that in the UK if you want to try it. And yeah, so we tried some ciders, and we found that they just didn't actually taste like the fruit they were supposedly made from. They were sweet and watery and thin. And so we thought, well, me being a winemaker and us having a wine background, why not have a crack at making a cider that's going to taste like a wine and taste like the fruit and be dry, because that's what we prefer, a dry cider and a dry wine. So that's what we did, and that's what we set out to do. And being purists, I guess, I'm one to kind of follow these techniques and make sure that what I make is true to type, and doing the bottle fermentation a la, as it were, champagne, but actually cider, as Oz has pointed out, was the only way, in my view, to deliver our cider as we like it, with a fine, delicate bubble, which didn't take away from the aromas and flavors of apples and pears, which have delicate flavors depending on, again, which varieties you use.
Did you have any role models?
Any role models?
Yeah.
In cider?
Yeah.
Well, I guess, yeah. Well, obviously James Healy's, but he's a great role model. My life has been spent in the wine game, but actually as an agent for a French oak cooperage. So I've visited every winery in Australia and New Zealand for 20 years. So there's probably lots of role models out there. As far as cider goes,
were there actual flavors that you'd come across before? I'm just thinking it's serendipitous this, but the guy who used to be the boss at Cloudy Bay used to make his own cider out of like in his garage, and that was the first time I tasted a really good New Zealand cider, and he made it by the traditional method. I don't think he sold it. He drank it all.
That was Ian Morden, if I'm correct. Yeah. He was a more recent boss after James left. So
yes, indeed, he was. Yeah.
But from a cider point of view, I guess going international, I mean, I have been fortunate enough to visit Eric Bordelais and also a guy called another Andreas Schneider from Germany, who makes Schneider's ciders. Those two guys have been pretty. It was great to meet them and get some tips, I suppose.
Because is there a cider tradition in New Zealand?
No, there's not. No, I mean Herman Seyfried, who came here in the early days from Germany, he did start making cider when he came straight to Nelson. I think that was his main plan, actually, to come here and make cider. But other than him, there hasn't really been anything made commercially, of note in the past, other than the odd, something out the back of an orchard, like probably what happened in the UK too.
Yeah, because I noticed that what's interesting about your beautiful, by the way, let's just pour it fresh so everyone can see. This is the bottle to make sure you've got the right one in your hands. Pour some fresh. Just watch that lovely bubble go up. Also, what's really interesting and exciting to me is it's not completely clear, and I'm sure that Mark will explain why that is a good thing in a moment. And just have a mouthful of it.
Sure, if you insist, Oz.
Because it's breakfast time for you, so you must be ready.
Oh, it's great. It's a great breakfast drink.
I think that is fantastically fresh. It's wonderfully pure on the palate. It's dry as a bone, and yet, and I noticed that the two cider apples that you have are the rarer bitter sharps, not bitter sweets, which is very interesting. Was that because you wanted bitter sharps, or because there aren't many cider apples around Nelson yet for you to choose from?
Yeah, no, it's certainly the latter. I mean, what we can get is what we can get, and until we start planting a few more varieties and actually get fruit. So, I mean, for us, we predominantly use Cox's orange pippin and Sturma pippin in the cider, and then the other varieties play a more of a minor part.
And what's interesting is you've got some pears in there as well. What
we do?
And they look as though they're dual purpose, or they're things like Packhams, those sorts of pears. Although I don't even know. Biscuit, Winter Nellis, Winter Coal. I mean, I've been trying to research them, and it's not easy. But
no, so those
I've got the pears there.
Yeah, so the pears, Winter Nellis and Winter Coal, they're the very russeted late season pears here, and I guess we use pears for. I like pears for aromatics, but also to because they have some natural unfermentable sugars that helps to balance out the acidity of the apples. So, I mean, the dryness on this is very dry. It's got 0.16 grams of glucose fructose, so zero glucose fructose. So, the pear for us gives some nice texture too.
Of course, because that's one of the secrets in perries, isn't it? These unfermentable sugars just take some of the, even in a bone dry drink, they just take some of the edge off it. And I thought this may be something to do with how you make it, and if you want to tell us now how you did, because I definitely found an aromatic sense of the skin of the apple, not just the tannins, but the actual aromatics of the skin. And I also thought there's that lovely bitterness, which isn't skin bitterness, it's pip bitterness. Now, on the whole, one was, oh, we don't want that. But I found it actually added something to the lovely, chewy freshness of this cider.
Yes, and I think, I guess, just going back quickly, the first time we made cider, we made it like I guess everyone else does, and we hand harvested the fruit, crushed the fruit, pressed it, and fermented the juice. But I kind of thought there wasn't enough flavour, and when I did some reading on apples and pears, it said all the aromas and flavours actually in the skins. So as being a winemaker, I thought, well, why don't I just ferment the whole fruit like you do? A red wine. Essentially, you're fermenting the full skin, seeds, the whole lot. And so that's what we did for the next 7 years, and did a lot of small batch trials and fermenting the whole fruit. So we hand pick it, we mill it straight into open top tanks, and then we ferment again with, as you say, cultured yeast or wild yeast, and we just let it ferment on the full skins. We plunge as well, just like you would a red wine, and so just to give it some air and feed the yeast a bit of oxygen, and also help macerate it up a bit more. And at the end, that's showing the video there. We put it into a basket press and we press it off, and that's when we end up with the juice. Well, it's actually the wine now. It's the apple-based wine in tank, and so. After that, it spends 6 to 9 months in tank aging. We don't do any fining or filtration. We just let it settle via gravity, and then we go rack to bottle. So we put the clear base wine into the bottle, and that's when we add a little bit of sugar and a little bit of yeast for the bottle fermentation. Hence, we call it methode. Methode essentially means bottle fermentation, and that is how you make Able methode cider or champagne cider, or as we say, the cider back in the UK where the champagne makers learnt from the UK people.
And the cloudiness, why is the cloudiness there?
Yeah, so I guess one of the key things we do, so when we put it in bottle with the sugar and yeast, and it bottle ferments, it sits in bottle over a period of, or up to 18 months. Normally, what you do when you make champagne is you would riddle, so the yeast in the bottle that's created from the fermentation would go into the neck of the bottle, and you'd then disgorge it. So you'd take the crown seal off, and you take that cloudy bit out of the champagne, and therefore you get a clear wine or champagne, if you like. For us, we don't disgorge. We just leave that sediment, that yeast sediment in the bottle, and that's why there is some cloudiness. And for us, that little bit of yeast in the bottle over time actually helps to keep the cider fresh and helps to give more texture and flavour and complexity. And we start going into those yeasty, bready, brioche characters, again, synonymous with champagne.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a tremendous drink and a great one to start us off this evening or this morning. So do I. Good. Now, let's move on. Let's move on to Once Upon a Tree. Let me just get this one up so everyone knows which one it is. This one, Once Upon a Tree, Bacchus cider. And you think, Bacchus cider? I thought Bacchus was a great variety. Well, maybe it is, because in the smaller letters it says Wine Lees cider. Now, this one comes from the west of England, Hereford, and it's made by an old friend of mine called Simon Day. And the first time I met Simon would have been at Three Quires vineyard in Gloucestershire, I should think, Simon. And that is in the village of Newent. Oh my God, who's that? No. I've still got that jacket. I've still got those jeans. As soon as the barber's open, I'll still have the same hairstyle. Wow. Dear, oh dear. But thank God I haven't got that ridiculous Dutch caravan any longer. That was when Hugh Dennis and I visited Now, is that the Dragon's Orchard?
That is Dragon Orchard.
Ah,
yeah.
This is one of the great orchards in Herefordshire, 150 to 200 years old. And Simon took me and Hugh there a few years ago. Well, look, let's just have a mouthful of this, and then Simon, you can tell us about this rather unusual but delicious cider you got here. Completely different in style from the Abel. Rounder, gentler, much more sort of evidence of that warmth of the yeast. It is almost winey in character. So, firstly, you are a winemaker as well as a cider maker, aren't you?
Yeah, that's right. So we make 16 Ridges wine here as well. We've got vineyards all around us and here in Ledbury. But we do make more cider than we do wine in terms of volume. And so the Once Upon a Tree is our cider range.
Why did you decide to do cider? Because you were a successful winemaker before you went to do Once Upon a Tree.
Yeah, so well, I'd been working as a consultant, putting people into vineyards and making wine in the UK and other places, but mostly in the UK. And I, because my brother-in-law, Martin, who you know, took over winemaking at Three Quires. So I didn't have a gig there, but I basically took over from my father when he retired and did consultancy for winemakers. But I was getting frustrated because I was telling people how to make cider, how to make wine, how to grow grapes, but I wasn't getting my hands dirty. And then I moved back to this part of the world where I grew up, just down the road from Newent, in just outside Ledbury, and of course surrounded by these beautiful orchards here. And that's when that little light bulb moment came to me. As I was walking my dog through these beautiful orchards, Dragon Orchard we just saw a picture of, and as a winemaker, you're always talking about how wine is made in the vineyard. And there I was passing these beautiful, stunning orchards, gorgeous fruit, and I just suddenly went, well, why isn't the same with cider? And I knew that the cider fruit from the Dragon Orchard was going into Bulmers, into mass production. So all that fantastic fruit being concentrated down, being beaten about with a big stick, and all the character taken out from it. So I just approached the owners, Anna Norman Stania, and said, look, I think I'd like to try something. I know a little bit about wine. You've got fantastic fruit. Is there something we can do together and start to make some cider? And this was back in 2007. There was quite a few people making cider at that point. A lot of it was farmhouse style, the more scrumpy style. But again, you mentioned it earlier about being the wine of England a few centuries ago. And if you go to the Hereford Cider Museum, you'll see these beautiful glass-cut glasses that cider used to be served in. You know, so it was very much the drink of the aristocracy. And I think, well, with the wine background, this beautiful fruit, can we do something that is more wine style? Can we make a cider which someone would be very pleased to bring to a dinner party, something that went really well with food? And that's how it all started. And it's evolved, and I don't like to stay still, and I like to experiment. And I would say I've been influenced more recently with trips to the States and what I'm doing with a cidery over there. And that is probably, again, another light bulb moment, is this combination, this co-fermentation, taking some of that also from craft beer, what's happening there, and how trendy collaborations are. Well, it's kind of made sense to collaborate with myself. I've got wine here in the same building. I've got, you know, grape skins. The first co-ferment I did was actually on Pinot Noir grape skins to make a rosé style cider with lots of beautiful Pinot Noir character coming through. But this particular one, so Bacchus, as you said, Oz, is a quite widely planted white wine grape in the UK, and 16 Ridges Bacchus is one of our more popular wines. And I was racking one of the 10,000 litre tanks there of the Bacchus. And when I got to the bottom, and the yeast, with about 200 litres of gross lees in there, this orangey yellow, glutinous, massive yeast, and it smelt gorgeous. And I just thought, we can't just throw that away. There's got to be something we can do with that. And outside, we were pressing our Dabinet apples for our cider. And I said, all right, let's pump some of that juice on top of these leaves and see what we can do with this, and see if we can capture some of that character in a cider. So moving on from the co-ferments that we were doing with the skins, I thought, well, perhaps we can get some character and interest into it. So we did that, and that was Dabinet juice on the yeast leaves, and it was working beautifully. And then over a period of 9 months, we did lees stirring, so the equivalent of batonnage, but in a stainless steel tank. Moving those yeast leaves back up through the cider and letting them settle out, and slowly those yeast cells breaking down and starting to do the autolysis characters that Mark was just talking about, and synonymous with great flavors and sparkling wine, and giving this creamy texture into the cider. What I decided partway through was that it needed a bit more acidity, because Dabinet's quite low in acidity. So we picked from Dragon Orchard, which you can see on screen now, we picked some dessert varieties, most of which was russet, Egremont russet, which is a beautiful apple, obviously to eat, but also it makes a wonderful cider, really nutty. And then I combined that into the cider as well. So it's a 50-50 bittersweet Dabinet and dessert apple. This picture actually just shows some of the, this is Dragon Orchard again. The trees in the foreground to the left are some of the dessert varieties. They grow over 30 different varieties of apple in that section, mostly dessert varieties, some heritage, some new varieties. Excuse me. In the background, you can see the taller trees. Those are the cider trees. Whereas the dessert apples have to be picked by hand because of the way that the trees are grown. It's very open, sort of goblet shape, which then hang down. And it's all about capturing, for dessert apples, you want the color. It's the appearance of the apple which is important. So you're trying to get those sun-blushed skins and so on. So sun exposure is important. With cider apples, sunlight's still important, but they grow into these 15, 20 foot high Christmas tree shaped trees, which is that's what we call a bush orchard, which was developed in the early 70s by Bulmers, in fact. And it's quite an intensive way of growing apples. And I think there's a picture later on of how we harvest those by machine. So there we go. So that's a tractor mounted shaker which goes on the machine and then shakes the apples down, so you don't have to climb up the tree to get them down. So yeah, we've got a couple of different methods of growing the fruit for these ciders, and of course harvesting them. And the apples do get bruised, but we're crushing them pretty rapidly from harvest through into and getting them into tank. And this just shows our press setup. So anyone that's familiar with vineyards will recognize some of the kit here. The bit, if you might not be able to see it because it might be behind our faces here, but on the right hand side of the picture is a scratter. You can see the apples being tipped and they're conveyed on a conveyor and sorted. So we've got somebody who will take out anything that's rotten or that shouldn't be there, any leaves or twigs or anything that might have been picked up. And they go through a washer and then milled into this very, well, sort of pea-sized chunks, which is what you see in the hopper there. And what Mark was talking about earlier about fermenting on skin, I don't do that with any of our ciders, but we do sometimes macerate, and we can put a cover over that hopper and leave it for sometimes up to 24 hours, which just gives the time. You talked about the tannins, Oz, gives the time for those to oxidize gently and become brown. What you can see in there, the very dark bit on the sides of the hopper there, that's actually pomace that's been there just that little bit longer. So that browning of the apple is those tannins oxidizing and becoming softer with that time. And then the whole lot's pumped into the press, which is a big wine press. So very gentle pressing. and very, very efficient press. And that's what it looks like as it's pouring out. So it's beautiful green, what am I trying to say? Beautiful brown liquid, amber liquid, there you go. Pouring out, very pure and absolutely delicious to drink straight from the press. And that is what goes into the tanks to make our ciders. So that's a bit of the early part of production. Oh, and there you go. There's the vineyard where the Bacchus is grown. So this is Bishop's Vineyard here on at Ledbury. You can see Ledbury in the distance there, and May Hill's just round to the right there. And there's some beautiful perry pear trees at the bottom of the vineyard, actually. This is, as I say, obviously goes into our wine, but that yeast that's left over just traps so much of that sort of elderflower, basil-y character that you get with the Bacchus.
I must admit, smelling it after it's been in the glass for a few minutes, that elderflower absolutely comes up,
doesn't it?
It's a delicious combination. It's a very felicitous combination, I think. And
I think could I just add in there? If champagne is next to Abel, then if you love Sauvignon, that's what this to me always kind of screams of that kind of aromatics and flavour of Sauvignon. If you love Sauvignon, then I think you'd really enjoy that.
And if you love Bacchus.
Well, and if you love Bacchus, but
Bacchus is really making its own statement now in Britain since last 4 or 5 years, especially with the kind of vintages we're having all over the country at the moment.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And do you ferment the just using the Bacchus yeast, or do you add other yeasts?
For this one, no, it was entirely the Bacchus. I mean, it was the yeast was actually a champagne yeast that we used initially for the wine, but it had taken up all this character, as I said. But
champagne yeast for the Bacchus. So whatever's left over, it'll revitalize itself with some new sugar coming in, and start again onto the apples.
Yeah, exactly. I'm going to just give you a little quick run down the cider here. There you go. There's one of our trial riddling racks there. So some of the champagne method ciders and wines that we've got there. So we do quite a lot of wild ferment here now. So we've got these big 23,000 litre tanks, which is a wild one. But we've got one here which is, I don't know, come up on that there, can you see? Slightly wonky. So this is a cabinet made with, I don't know, can you see the colour of that?
Yeah.
This is the champagne yeast. We keep it with the yeast in there for a fair while. This is actually only just finishing ferment, to be honest. The cider takes a long time to go through. It's in sort of low nutrient, so we're often still fermenting through to sort of April time. But in the past few years, so winemakers like to have a lot of control in the olden days, as in the last couple of decades. So, that's why the rise of cultured yeast and all the different characteristics that you can get from all the different sorts of yeast have become very popular. And as a cider maker, I had to learn to relax over the last, 10 years or so. And it's with other producers in the area, Tom Oliver being one of them, who's a fantastic wild ferment cider maker. Started giving me the impetus and the confidence to do that, and we don't do it on a fairly large scale. So yeah, we've got these big tanks. Don't know if you can pick up the difference there. It's a little bit browner. So the whole wild yeast is a whole succession of different yeasts that are naturally on the apple from dragon orchards that then take this through a whole stage of different fermentations, and you get this real sort of different. The champagne yeast is very clean. It speaks volumes about the variety and the fruit that comes from the orchard. But with a wild yeast ferment, you get these extra layers of complexity and sort of some funky aromas sometimes. It's a little bit of gambling involved, because you never know exactly how it's going to turn out. But I've become much more confident with it in the last 2 or 3 years.
But are you going to keep using both types of yeast?
It depends on what I want to make at the final product, really. So if it's going to go into secondary fermentation and make it into a champagne style, then we'll probably use, well, I would use a champagne yeast so that we've got that continuity through into secondary fermentation in bottle. But if I'm making something that's I want a little bit more interest out, things like our Tidner Wood cider is a completely wild ferment and oak age, and so it's just about what sort of characters you want to get out of the ciders.
Yeah. Well, Simon, I think that's fascinating, and I think this is a really interesting cider with so many different flavors from the wine side and the apple side going on. I think we should go over to Vermont now, which now this time of day in Vermont, is it sort of in the middle of the night or the middle of the day? Let me think. You're 5 hours behind, aren't you?
Yes, it's 4:22.
It's just a nice tea time cider.
Yes, exactly. Time to crack it open.
Eleanor runs a wonderful operation called Eden Specialty Ciders in Vermont, which is bang up in the top end of New England. Now, the one might say, has cider got much political or historical or social importance in America? Well, it does, because the modern America was founded by the people who went over on the Mayflower. Now, the Mayflower wouldn't have got to America. They went through a terrible storm, and the mast beam was ripped apart in the storm. And it's only because they had a cider press on board, and they managed to take this enormous wooden screw and wrap it into the beam that allowed them, the Mayflower, to continue and get to America at all. So and within 9 days in America, they'd already planted apple trees. So I think it's pretty reasonable to say that cider is America's original oldest alcoholic drink. And certainly by 1775, that's a bit later, but just before independence, 1 farm in 10 in New England had a cider mill. Virtually every farm had apple trees, and cider was a sort of currency. You paid the doctor with cider, you paid the shoemaker with cider, you paid your children's teacher with cider. And this is greatly abetted by the complete failure of America to establish vineyards. They wanted to establish vineyards. They brought the best possible European vines over, but they were all destroyed by a little aphid called the phylloxera aphid, which just ate all these American vines. So the apple from the Carolinas right the way up to Maine and Vermont, right up on the Canadian border, it assumed a position of massive importance in American life, not for food, but also for self-sufficiency in drink through cider and through brandy, cider brandy. And it's almost horrifying to see how that amazing tradition completely collapsed in the 20th century. And maybe, Eleanor, you can just take us through how one went from cider being the drink of the nation to it being an almost forgotten activity.
Yes, and just to acknowledge first that we don't really know what the first fermented beverage of America was, because we really only know the white European history that brought it over. So
Didn't I make that
clear?
Yeah, sorry.
People talk about how prohibition is what killed cider, but really cider was on its last gasp by that point, because of the whole industrialization of the economy in the 19th century and the move from the country to the cities, away from an agrarian lifestyle to a more industrial lifestyle. And you couldn't bring your apple trees with you to the city very easily, nor were they coming over with new waves of immigrants. So beer really became the popular drink of choice. and it was cheap. And so that's, died out when Prohibition was over. People came back to beer, wine, and spirits, but there was no place for cider in the Alcohol Beverage Act of the Federal Alcohol Act of 1933 that reversed Prohibition. So it's really only in the past 20 to 30 years that cider has started to have a revival. And the large part of the revival in terms of dollars and volume came with the introduction of Angry Orchard in 2011 by Boston Beer Company. But the real revival of real cider started happening in the late 1980s when a couple of enterprising growers who were looking at global commodity apple markets and saying, I'm not going to survive this, what was happening. I need to figure out something else to do. Actually came over to England and some to France and brought Scion wood back for those tannic cider apples to figure out, is there potential for a market for really good cider here in the US? And Steve Wood was one of those enterprising growers. He's about an hour and a half down the road from me, and a number of his apple varieties and his fruit are actually in the cider that we're tasting tonight.
Brilliant. So now, are you from a cider family or an agricultural family, or were you doing something entirely different before this hit you?
Oh, I'm a bit like Andreas. I was doing something more theoretical.
You look as though you're
So I
born.
have to say I come from the consumer side of the business.
Yeah, you look as though you were just absolutely born to it, standing in front of that wonderful old barn there.
Oh yeah, yep. So we started making cider in 2007. We had this old farm, and it was not a successful. It had been a dairy farm at one point. It really died out, and rather than having it put up for development or just letting the local farmer hay it, we decided, well, let's plant some apple trees. And we're very close to the Canadian border, and ice cider is something that was developed in southern Quebec, which is literally, I can see it from my cidery. And we thought, why don't we try and do that? Beg your pardon?
Is that the Canadian border? Where?
Yes, that dotted line at the top is the Canadian border.
Yeah.
Yep. So so we started making ice cider. We were the first in the U.S. to have a federally approved label for ice cider. And then in 2011, as cider became a thing, and we realized we had relationships with all these wonderful small scale growers that were growing interesting varieties of fruit, that we could make some great dry cider as well. We continue to be a small producer whose passion is all about supporting small scale, holistically grown fruit with interesting varieties that's grown on purpose for making cider. And while people often refer to cider as the traditional American beverage from the colonial days, my perspective is much more about really learning as much as I can about all the flavors of all the different varieties and how they blend together, and experimentation, with the goal being to create something that's delicious that goes with food. So we talk about cider as wine. It's bringing the perspective of wine to a beverage that is uniquely related to apples, and the flavors of apples, and where the flavors of apples are better with food than the flavors of grapes, because in many cases it's true. Here's a picture. This is just our ice cider operation. So you can see all these containers are actually freezing juice that we've pressed in the winter outside, and you'll see more of that from Andreas as well.
No, I think that thing about cider with food is enormously important. And I just noticed that you said for your food pairings that you like things like sushi, which is basically from a non-wine culture, pad thai, which is from a non-wine culture. So many of the things that we eat on a weekly basis and try to put wine with are actually from a non-wine culture. And that's why one looks, especially so much of Southern Asian and Eastern Asian and Southeast Asian food, let alone African food and Middle Eastern food, it doesn't come from a grape wine culture. Cider, this purer, brighter fruit quality and this lovely acidity which tickles the side of your mouth, it makes fantastic sense with an awful lot of those cultures. So,
And there are key parts of our own culture where cider is, I mean, apples are better food pairings. When you think about how you use apples in cooking, right? So applesauce and pork chops, right? Cider goes with pork way better than grapes do, right? Sausages, caramel in dessert wines. Like if you're doing chocolate is a great red wine pairing. Caramel is an amazing ice cider pairing.
mm,
I mean, there are things that you can just look at and say, I know apples taste good with this. I know cider is going to be good with this.
and northeast of the United States, cheeses.
Cheeses.
You know,
Yes.
to be honest, cheese is better with cider than wine on the whole.
Yes.
And we've had hundreds of years of the Europeans and the French particularly saying, but wine and cheese is it. Well, if you go around the west of England,
Yeah, not really.
you won't be hearing them saying that. And I bet you don't hear them saying that in Maine and Vermont and New Hampshire.
Yes. And we have some wonderful cheddar tradition here in Vermont that, so hats off to the original.
Would you like to do, there are three wonderful orchards which I know that you work with: Windfall, Jessica Yates, and your own. And is it true that where the Windfall orchard's it's called the Champagne Valley?
So Champlain, like Samuel Champlain,
Yep.
this discoverer, yes, Champlain. It's right off of Lake Champlain, but it's very, very close to Champagne. You're right.
And the kind of varieties that you've got 11 varieties. By the way, this is the bottle if anyone hasn't seen it.
Yes.
I would love to ask Anna, who wrote the label?
Oh, that's what happens when your owner drinks a lot of cider at night and then starts writing labels. That would be me.
What I thought. Siren Song, Beguiling Harvest Cider, and about 8 lines later, we're still being beguiled by the I would say the rapturous prose style of whichever part of the ownership wrote this label. But it's a lovely label. But one of the things it does say on it is all the different grape varieties, and you've got grape variety of apple varieties. You've got apple varieties here from 4 different countries. From France and Holland and Britain and America itself.
Yes.
You've got 5 different dessert varieties. You've got 6 different cider varieties, 5 of them bittersweets, 1 of them bitter sharp. And I think it makes a really fabulous, firstly, a fabulously interesting historical statement, but also adds a lot of complexity to the palate. Now, did you choose these one by one, and do you co-ferment all the apples, or do you have the apples, each variety, fermented separately?
The answer to all of that is yes.
Good.
So it's some of everything. This cider was some of the most wonderful fruit that was going into the press. So as the fruit came in from the orchards that we work with and our own orchard, we were looking and saying, oh gosh, this stuff is just amazing. And we and sort of, you put that special star on the tank as you're pressing it in, and sort of like this is going to be great. So there some I think the Somerset Red Streak, for example, was in a 155-gallon stainless steel barrel. And a couple of the other varieties we fermented together because we had just little amounts of them. And then they were fermented, they're aged, and then this is a blend. So this is down to blending at the end of it to put this together. And part of it is we like to have in our portfolio, we have a very passionate cider club. We love our cider club members, and they are looking for us to deliver them, some interesting variety of ciders, not just all dry, not just all sweet. And so we like to always have something in our portfolio that has some tannin and residual sweetness. So this is, and I guess this is sort of my point and why I wanted to talk about this cider in particular, which is I'm not trying to make a traditional French style cider or traditional English style cider or, what American cider would have been in 1650 in Massachusetts in the Bay Colony. I'm basically looking to say, what can I put together from amazing fruit to make something delicious, regardless of the original origin of the fruit. So we like to have something that's got tannin with some residual sweetness, And because it has residual sweetness, it is carbonated as opposed to a natural secondary fermentation, which we would not have a way to stop. Right, it would just go and it would make it dry. So, so this is filtered and then carbonated, but no pasteurization, no preservatives, it is fantastic with something like barbecue pork roast, where you've got that sweetness, smokiness, a little bit of spice, and then this tannin that could stand up to it with a little bit of sweetness to match the barbecue.
There is a smokiness, isn't there? And there's also something, the tannins from 11 different apples with different levels of tannin. It's almost got a slightly wood bark kind of quality to the tannin, which is fascinating. And there is something a little saline about it. I noticed some salinity on Mark's cider, the Abel cider as well. And that also just adds a lovely extra dimension on your palate.
Yep, a little more volume.
I have to say, if that's how holistic turns out, Eleanor, I think this is a beautiful cider. By the way, I did notice a Dammy Burgundy barrel in that picture that you quickly flashed past, which seemed to have Kingston Black in it, which is a fabulous bitter sharp, isn't it? And there we are, yes. And certainly in Britain, Kingston Black was always regarded as one of the relatively few varieties which should be made as a vintage single varietal. And is that why you've put it in a Burgundy barrel? Yes,
absolutely. And I know, Simon, you make a single variety Kingston Black, don't you, as well? Yeah. Yeah, it is a balanced apple in terms of its sugar, acidity, and tannin, so that you can make a single variety that's got some nice balance to it. It can have some weird flavors. Yeah. There's a little bit of sort of like furniture polish and beeswax and things that come along with it, but it's a balanced cider.
Yeah, and it's as a bitter sharp. It's not too. It goes.
It's not too sharp. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Well, I think that's fantastic, and I think it's time to head. I think even further north than Vermont. But
yes, we're at the 45th parallel, which seems very far north to me, but nowhere near to where Andreas is.
Andreas, the 45th parallel, that's like where you go to work in shorts.
Kindergarten.
Andreas goes to work.
Yeah.
Andreas, welcome. Andreas makes Brännland cider from so far north in Sweden that I'm presuming in the middle of March is still virtually dark all day long.
Well, I would like to say yes, but it's not. Fairly dark, but spring is coming on, and of course, being where we are, we get a lot more light in summer. So we're also moving towards a much longer daytime period, which at the end of June hits 22 hours of the daylight. So really dark in December and really light in June, July. Yeah.
Now, are you from a cider background? Why did you suddenly decide to go to somewhere where, as far as I can make out, no one has ever made cider before? I'm not sure they've ever even grown apples.
Well, no, they haven't grown apples, and nobody's made serious cider in Sweden for a very long time, up until about 8 or 10 years ago. Why did I start? I don't know. I come from a background as a musician and songwriter, and I as a consequence, I got into music software and started a business with some friends that grew. And then I got tired of it and jumped ship. And I think that, well, it's a long story of why I'm interested in wine, basically. But I think, as cheesy as it's going to sound, winemaking reminds me a lot about playing and writing music. And I think there's a connection there that is a mix between craft and art, which really drew me. to it.
There have been some great Swedish winemakers in places like France, but you may be thinking like a winemaker and like a musician probably, but you headed north, not south.
I mean, I'm not one for buying a timeshare in Tuscany, so I wanted to stay at home and still make wine. And in the village where I lived, which was called Brännland, there was a lot of apples falling to the ground. So I started out in my garage with the thought of making a really simple French or English style cider from garden apples. But of course, for various reasons, one of them being that I didn't know what I was doing, the first cider didn't taste very good. But also because all the apples that we grow here in the gardens and commercially are all dessert style apples. And so I started looking for a style of cider that would fit those apples rather than try to have those apples fit another style. And I came up on ice cider, and I started experimenting. And then I found a fantastic mentor and teacher in Vermont named Eleanor Leger. She taught me how to make ice cider. So it's all her doing, actually.
So I noticed you talk about the Quebec standards, and I know that Eleanor is virtually a few miles away from Quebec at the very northern tip of the United States. Can you tell me something about the Quebec standards? What do they mean?
I will, and then Eleanor will correct me if I'm wrong. I might be on outdated info, but the Quebec standard basically says that ice cider has to be made using natural cold to concentrate the juice. There are two methods that are allowed to extract the juice. One is called cryo extraction, and it's where you pick apples that are still on the trees in February, March, Eleanor, April, much like ice wine, basically. And what happens to the apples as they hang on the trees is they freeze, but they mostly desiccate, and moisture passes out of the apple, and the remaining liquid is much sweeter, relatively speaking, much sweeter. Now, as far as I understand it, there are very few producers at this point that have full-on orchards where the apples still hang after frost. There are a bunch, and I know Eleanor has some stuff in her orchard as well, right? That is sort of leaning towards that. The other method that's
Golden Russet and Cortland are the two that will hang on here.
Cool. Yeah, because that's where I want to go too, of course, but long time until we get there. So the other method that's allowed is that you pick the apples in October, you keep them in cold storage, and you press at a point where it's cold enough outside to freeze the juice in these 1,000 liter IBC plastic tanks. And so when I started out with dessert apples in Sweden, trying to make dry cider, that was not very good. When I found ice cider, it was like divine intervention because the climate fit ice cider really well, and the apples fit ice cider really well. So you need to concentrate with natural cold, and then an ice cider has to start at least 30 bricks of sweetness. It has to have between 8 and 13% alcohol. Eleanor, is that what it is? And it needs to have at least 130 grams of residual sugar.
7 to 13 alcohol.
Oh, 7 to 13 alcohol. Yeah. So, yeah.
What are the acids?
Well, I don't know if there are rules for the acids, but the acids are typically much higher in sweet apple wine than they are in sweet grape wine. So a standard ice cider from us will run, depending on the model, the claim you're drinking tonight has 13 grams of total acidity, and I think the 2018 ice cider has 17 to 18 grams. Which compared to a Mosel sweet wine is twice as much.
I think that's what is the genius of ice cider, because I must admit I've got a little tired of ice wines. I've begun to find that the mixture of acidity and intense sugar and rather similar flavors, I've just got a little bit bored. So when I came across initially the Quebec ones, but now delightedly a European wine, which I have to say this claim is completely different to the Quebec ones that I know. I'm delighted that
Likewise, very different, yeah.
Yeah. I think this is an absolute star wine. But tell me what about claim. It sounds as though this isn't necessarily your normal ice cider.
No, I mean, we make 2 ice ciders that are heavily concentrated, that has a lot of residual sugar. And then a few years ago, we started identifying a number of fermentations that were from the same harvest and the same extraction dates and the same apple varieties. And this is a lower sugar material that we fermented that used to go into the ice cider blend. But we started identifying that because they started fermentation at a lower sugar level, they were showing a completely different expression. And so in 2017, we decided to break it out of the main ice cider blend and bottle it on its own to try to find the equivalent of an Auslese, an ice cider Auslese. So a lighter sweet wine, basically. But there's still 90 grams of residual sugar. So this is an ice cider that would not survive the appellation in Quebec. It doesn't have enough residual sugar. But so here's the reasoning behind that. There's no appellation in Europe for ice cider. There's a lot of ice cider coming out of Europe right now that would certainly not, because of the concentration method, be considered in Quebec. And so because of that, we decided to break with the Quebec tradition or the Quebec rule book that, of course, we respect deeply, because we are still making a true ice wine here, and it has a valid, it has a value in its own right. So we call it an ice cider still, but we would not be allowed to in Canada for sure.
But that's what I might call the new world state of mind.
Yeah, but in the old world.
I know it's not the rules. Your new world in the old world.
Yep.
It's not the rules, but I know that I'm making something special and delicious and individual, because I think this at 90 grams of sugar with that 12 grams, 13 grams of acidity is a fantastic drink. And although I'd frankly like to just drink it by itself, I'm sure that this could go with all kinds of those wonderful northern kind of desserts that I know so well from Sweden, and those wonderful berries like lingon's and things, which are not terribly sweet, and yet they've been, or if they've got sugar in them, the acid levels are sufficiently high, and that's exactly what happens here. I think it's exhilarating, it's mouth-watering, it's very rich, but it isn't sweet. And I think that's I don't really care whether it conforms to anything at all, except to the rule of this is a fantastic drink, and I'm delighted you made it.
Yeah, I mean, and I want to say again, I mean, Eleanor has been hugely important here. I think that although we've deviated from the Quebec style of ice cider at this point, and we also work with German Riesling makers from the Rheingau and from Mosel, I think Eleanor's ice ciders were already, when I tasted them the first time, much more classic in their profile, tighter and lighter and more ethereal than the Quebec ones that are often heavy on residual sugar and heavy on alcohol, and they can be great. So I'm not disrespecting, but Eleanor was making ice cider that was 10% alcohol. And that was really interesting. And the reason that we now are privileged enough to work with Markus Lundén, who is the winemaker at Georg Breuer in Rheingau in Riedesheim, is that he was attracted to the fact that we already ran pretty low on alcohol and pretty light for a sweet wine. And that's Eleanor's doing. So it's interesting with that line of what is heritage, what is legacy, what is heirloom.
Yeah.
it's incredible really to sit here with Eleanor now, because yeah, it's fantastic.
And talking of what is traditional, what is heirloom, what's the situation with cider orchards in the north of Sweden? Do you have any?
There are none, and I think there are quite a few people who would like to have me committed for saying that there can be cider orchards here. But we started establishing trial orchards 5 or 6 years ago, and they've done well, or better than anyone thought, for sure. And so in 2019 we were granted a very large innovation project from the European Union, from the EIP Agri Fund of the European Union, to establish another 10 hectares together with other farmers in the north. So you know, theoretically, the orchards that we have that are even further north, we have 2 small trial orchards 100 kilometers north of Umeå. They're theoretically the northernmost cider orchards in the world. And of course, the goal is to build a terroir here.
And you don't even know what that terroir is. It's exciting. It's like
we're getting a hint of it, but we don't know yet.
But when Mark's father-in-law James turned up in New Zealand, they didn't know what the terroir in New Zealand was. And that's been one of the most thrilling things about wine in New Zealand, was people didn't know. They had to find it out. And so that's wonderful for you to think, I don't know what this terroir is.
I mean, yeah,
it knows what his terroir is down in Gloucester. They've been at it for 1,000 years.
Yeah. I mean, we have about 70 different varieties spread over 1.5 hectares in trials now. So it's crazy.
Varieties, or are any of them classic varieties?
No, they're all Finnish, Russian, old Swedish varieties.
Yeah.
That are specifically developed for tough climates.
Yeah. Well, I haven't shown people the bottle. Just one more time. This is the bottle. I can't even see where the front and where the back is. Here we are. It's a beautifully elegant bottle. It's an absolutely delicious wine, and I must admit, all 4 of the wines today have shown fabulous personality. And if anybody is in any doubt at all that these drinks absolutely can, if you want to, be put on exactly the same table as fine bottles of wine, well, these 4 bottles of cider will prove that absolutely, standing as they are. Now, I wonder whether, if anybody wants to have some chat, some questions. Richard's got that enthusiastic look on his face, which
well, we've got loads actually. Like, everyone's been buzzing this evening. Like, honestly, I don't think we've had our chat so full with questions and just comments generally. I think no one can really, I think there's no doubt that sort of cider is wine. I think we've really shown that this evening with the way that it's made. I think the care that you all put into it, and, you know, how much terroir impacts everything, I think, and, you know, the type of apple as well. And, you know, there's so much history there as well behind it that, I mean, I'm definitely new to this as well. I think it's incredible to learn about. A few sort of key questions that I pulled out. So I'm going to start with a question early on, which was from Joanne Holt. So Joanne's asked if you drink your ciders sort of cold or at room temperature, or, you know, does it depend on what sort of cider it is? I don't know. I think I'm probably going to go to Andreas. You called her your sort of Jedi Master earlier. I'm going to go with Eleanor first, if that's okay, for this question.
We're talking about temperature for cider. And
Yeah.
I think I completely agree with whichever one of my panelists said, or actually maybe it was Susanna, was saying, you know, for something like the Abel, a little bit chilled, just like you would a white wine. And for something that has a little more robust tannin, you know, maybe not quite as chilled. A good friend of mine who's also in the business, we talk about serving things at castle temperature, sort of low 50s maybe.
50s. So I think what that translate to in English. What is that, like 60?
Yeah.
Dungeon temperature.
Dungeon temperature.
Okay, cool. And do we think, I mean, another question we've got here from gentleman called Adam King. He's asked how long, once it's been open, how long can the cider last? I mean, again, does that depend on, let's say once you pull the cork, like how long can it be open for? How long can you drink for? And also, like how long can you age things, cider for? I think I'm going to direct this one to you, Simon, as obviously you've had experience in the wine, and cider fields. I think you might have a bit of insight.
Well, I continue to learn, to be quite honest. I think cider, before it's opened, has great aging potential, generally speaking, particularly if it's made with high tannin varieties, such as in our part of the world here in Herefordshire. And often it will benefit from several years of age, be it in tank, barrel, or in bottle. And it's definitely a product that you can lay down, and it will evolve and improve or change in character. In terms of popping a cork and sticking it in your fridge, well, cider doesn't tend to last very long in our household when you do that. But I think actually, interestingly, the ice ciders do actually last quite a long time in my experience in the fridge. So if you pop a cork on what you think might be an expensive bottle of ice cider, it will last you a few good meals. So yeah, stopper it well. If you've got a vacuum van or similar, then that's great, or something that puts a bit of CO2 on the top. That same rules as wine, really. But yeah, they tend to last pretty well.
Okay.
We've heard a lot of talk about acidity this evening, and tannin as well. And these are two great preserving pillars of ciders. And this is ample reason to say, A, they last for a long time in the bottle which they're bottled, but B, they also last for more time than wines last. I mean, take the Sauterne comparison, if you like, with ice cider. Sauterne might have a similar sort of sugar level as an ice cider, but it has maybe half the level of acidity. So you won't find that it lasts as long in the fridge with a cork stopper in as an ice cider. And this also is adds another dimension around food matching as well, which is terrifically important. The acidities within these ciders help them marry and align with foods that wine just really struggles with. Southeast Asian food is being generalist about it, but sweet, sour, chili, spice, herbs, you've got all those powerful flavors going on. These ciders, because of the acidity and the tannin structures, match really well with those types of foods. So aging and food in one answer.
Well, no, I was gonna. That's actually led me on to another question, Alistair. I think this one comes from David Seal. He's asked sort of, could we each give me your sort of favorite pairings with each of your ciders, just as a quick blast. Let's start with you, Mark, and then go Andreas, then Eleanor, then Simon.
I'm so sorry. I have a customer commitment at in 1 minute that I didn't realize this was going to bump up against. It's totally my fault. I'm incredibly embarrassed. It was wonderful. Thank you. Thanks everybody for joining.
See you again,
so
Eleanor.
much.
Take care.
Thanks. I'll do Eleanor's food.
Yeah,
Cool.
Totally capable.
To be honest, Richard, for me, I'd actually just right now in New Zealand, it's basically bluff oyster season, and tell you what, if people think champagne and oysters goes well, we should try some Abel and oysters. It's delicious, absolutely delicious. So that's just a very simple cleansing, fresh out of the sea, that salinity that Oz talked about. Our cider with oysters, banging.
I'd agree.
Sounds delicious. Andreas?
Okay, so for the claim, I mean, I'd like to say everything, but that would be really stupid. No, we actually, part of the reason we broke it out was that we also needed something that was more parable than the full-on ice ciders that are sometimes twice as much residual sugar. But the claim is good cheese wine, good with classic like tatin, good with foie gras, good with creme brulee, but also interesting to drink ice ciders with fried chicken or fried fowl in general.
Wow.
And Claim also works with oysters, but really well with cooked oysters like Rockefeller.
Nice.
If you're not too snobby to eat Rockefeller. But so yeah, so because of that high acidity, you get a semi-sweet wine, you know, or a demi-sec rather than a completely sweet wine as you tasted. And so yeah, it goes with everything. But no, but I mean, I drink it myself without a pairing. I drink it as a meditational wine.
Meditational or meditation?
Representative, obviously, you know?
And Simon, how about you? I think oysters is a great pairing for ciders generally. I'm not particularly the Bacchus one, but I think cider and oysters is a wonderful pairing, generally speaking. For the Bacchus cider, I quite like it with some creamy flavors, so creamy curries or something like we had it with a Moroccan tagine that we cooked, and it worked perfectly. And that was unusual. I wasn't expecting that, but that was a really good pairing. And that's the thing, is you just keep trying, keep experimenting. That's what I'm doing all the time. I love cooking. I'm delving into Japanese cookery thanks to CiderCon a few weeks ago, where we saw a Japanese demonstration with cider. There's a whole plethora of different food matching experiences to be had with cider.
And then, I mean, actually, Alistair, you did actually send me an image which sort of shows you sort of the pairings, haven't you, of cider and pairings, and I'll make sure that everyone.
I was meant to go to the audience, actually. My mistake. Yes, no, I mean, we've got a food and cider matching wheel that we've created that we're quite happy to share around, and I'll put it in the chat in a minute. But as far as the Eden Siren song is concerned, my sort of immediate what springs to mind is a spring roll, and a lovely fresh crisp spring roll with nice crunchy vegetables and just a touch of the Chinese spices. That's immediately what springs to mind. But I think there's a whole wide variety of different foods that it can pair with. You know, fatty pork, belly pork, absolutely fantastic. You can be classic or you can be more adventurous than that. Curries, I think lighter curries would also go really well with the siren song. And I think what I'm fascinated by is this balance of sweetness, acidity, tannin, really going on, and then aligning next to more powerful flavors, more powerful spices like from Indian curries and so on. So that's my suggestion.
Thank you very much, Alistair. That's great. I think it just shows the diversity, isn't it? And you know, I think with so much complexity behind the sort of ciders that you can, you know, do cider and food matching, I think it definitely makes it worthwhile doing. So I think actually that's all we've got time for this evening. I'd like to first of all thank all of you, our guests, for coming here. Mark, Andrea, Simon, Alistair. Well, obviously Eleanor's now left us. Thank you. You've all been. I mean, for me, it's been captivating. It's been really interesting to learn about cider in this way. It definitely is a wine. I think that's sort of. I think we've established that today. Oz, thank you for hosting as usual. You've been wonderful, and thanks to all of our audience for joining us. You've been. I mean, you've obviously had a really good night. I can see everyone's. I mean, I'm getting people shouting out, you know, people are apples of eyes and things like this, you know, people are having a great time. So
I think the apples are certainly blowing your mind too, Richard.
They are indeed. They are indeed. Well, look, if you've enjoyed today's show, we've got a couple more things coming up. So we've got a Rueda tasting and something that's on the pipeline is a tasting from New Zealand as well. And I think we're going to be sending you some information about the ciders that you've had today, You're going to have a special offer as well, I think, from Alistair. He's put something together for anybody who wants to join, who wants to buy any of the ciders or any other ciders from Cider is Wine. So thanks everyone for having us. Well, thanks for coming. Really appreciate it. And we'll see you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Oz. Thanks, Alistair. Nice to see you guys.
See you, everyone.
To see it.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much,
Those
everyone. Good night.
Good day.
All right.